Chapter 13 of A Dog Crusoe and His Master. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 13. Escape from the Indians. A Discovery. Alone in the Desert. Dick Varley had spent so much of his boyhood in sporting about among the waters of the rivers and lakes near which he had been reared, and especially during the last 2 years had spent so much of his leisure time in rolling and diving with his dog Crusoe in the lake of Mustang Valley, that he had become almost as expert in the water as a South Sea Islander, so that when he found himself whirling down the rapid river, as already described, he was more impressed with a feeling of gratitude to God for his escape from the Indians than anxiety about getting ashore. He was not altogether blind or indifferent to the danger into which he might be hurled if the channel of the river should be found lower down to be broken with rocks, or should a waterfall unexpectedly appear. After floating down a sufficient distance to render pursuit out of the question, he struck it into the bank opposite to that from which he had plunged, and, clambering up to the green sward above, stripped off the greater part of his clothing and hung it on the branches of a bush to dry. Then he sat down on the trunk of a fallen tree to consider what course he had best pursue in his present circumstances. These circumstances were by no means calculated to inspire him with hope or comfort. He was in the midst of an unknown wilderness, hundreds of miles from any white man's settlement, surrounded by savages, without food or blanket, his companions gone, he knew not whither, perhaps taken and killed by the Indians, his horse dead, and his dog, the most trusty and loving of all his friends, lost to him, probably forever. A more veteran heart might have quailed in the midst of such accumulated evils, but Dick Varley possessed a strong, young, and buoyant constitution, which, united with a hopefulness of disposition that almost nothing could overcome, enabled him very quickly to cast aside the gloomy view of his case and turn to its brighter aspects. He still grasped his good rifle, and that was some comfort, and as his eye fell upon it, he turned with anxiety to examine the condition of his powder horn and the few things that he had been fortunate enough to carry away with him about his person. The horn, in which Western hunters carry about their powder, is usually that of an ox. It is closed up at the large end with a piece of hardwood fitted tightly into it, and the small end is closed with a wooden peg or stopper. It is, therefore, completely watertight, and may be for hours immersed without the powder getting wet, unless the stopper should chance to be knocked out. Dick found, to his great satisfaction, that the stopper was fast, and the powder perfectly dry. Moreover, he had by good fortune filled it full 2 days before from the package that contained the general stock of ammunition, so that there were only 2 or 3 charges out of it. His percussion caps, however, were completely destroyed, and even though they had not been, it would have mattered little, for he did not possess more than half a dozen. But this was not so great a misfortune as at first might seem, for he had the spare flint locks and the little screwdriver necessary for fixing and unfixing them stowed away in his shot pouch. To examine his supply of bullets was his next care, and slowly he counted them out, one by one, to the number of 30. This was a pretty fair supply, and with careful economy would last him many days. Having relieved his mind on these all-important points, he carefully examined every pouch and corner of his dress, to ascertain the exact amount and value of his wealth. Besides the leather leggings, moccasins, deerskin hunting shirt, cap, and belt, which composed his costume, he had a short, heavy hunting knife, a piece of tinder, a little tin pannikin, which he had been in the habit of carrying at his belt, and a large cake of maple sugar. This last is a species of sugar which is procured by the Indians from the maple tree. Several cakes of it had been carried off from the Pawnee village, and Dick usually carried one in the breast of his coat. Besides these things, he found that the little Bible, for which his mother had made a small inside breast pocket, was safe. Dick's heart smote him when he took it out and undid the clasp, for he had not looked at it until that day. It was firmly bound with a brass clasp, so that although the binding and edges of the leaves were soaked, the inside was quite dry. On opening the book to see if it had been damaged, a small paper fell out. Picking it up quickly, he unfolded it and read in his mother's handwriting, "Call upon me in the time of trouble, and I will deliver thee, and thou shalt glorify me. My son, give me thine heart." Dick's eyes filled with tears, while the sound, as it were, of his mother's voice thus reached him unexpectedly in that lonely wilderness. Like too many whose hearts are young and gay, Dick had regarded religion, if not as a gloomy, at least as not a cheerful thing. But he felt the comfort of these words at that moment, and he resolved seriously to pursue his mother's parting gift in time to come. The sun was hot, and a warm breeze gently shook the leaves, so that Dick's garments were soon dry. A few minutes served to change the locks of his rifle, draw the wet charges, dry out the barrels, and reload. Then, throwing it across his shoulder, he entered the wood and walked lightly away. And well he might, poor fellow, for at that moment he felt light enough in person, if not in heart. His worldly goods were not such as to oppress him, but the little note had turned his thoughts towards home, and he felt comforted. Traversing the belt of woodland that marked the course of the river, Dick soon emerged on the wide prairie beyond, and here he paused in some uncertainty as how he should proceed. He was too good a backwoodsman, albeit so young, to feel perplexed as to the points of a compass. He knew pretty well what hour it was, so that the sun showed him the general bearings of the country, and he knew that when night came he could correct his course by the pole star. Dick's knowledge of astronomy was limited. He knew only one star by name, and that one was an inestimable treasure of knowledge. His perplexity was owing to his uncertainty as to the direction in which his companions and their pursuers had gone, for he had made up his mind to follow their trail if possible, and to render all the succour his arm might afford. To desert them and make for the settlement, he held, would be a faithless and cowardly act. While they were together, Joe Blunt had often talked to him about the route he meant to pursue to the Rocky Mountains, so that, if they had escaped the Indians, he thought there might be some chance of finding them at last. But, to set against this, there was the probability that they had been taken and carried away in a totally different direction, or they might have taken to the river, as he had done, and gone further down without his observing them. Then again, if they had escaped, they would be sure to return and search the country round for him, so that if he left the spot he might miss them. "Oh, for my dear pup Crusoe!" he exclaimed aloud in this dilemma. But the faithful ear was shut now, and the deep silence that followed his cry was so oppressive that the young hunter sprang forward at a run over the plain, as if to fly from solitude. He soon became so absorbed, however, in his efforts to find the trail of his companions, that he forgot all other considerations, and ran straight forward for hours together, with his eyes eagerly fixed on the ground. At last he felt so hungry, having tasted no food since supper time the previous evening, that he halted for the purpose of eating a morsel of maple sugar. A line of bushes in the distance indicated water, so he sped on again, and was soon seated beneath a willow drinking water from the cool stream. No game was to be found here, but there were several kinds of berries, among which wild grapes and plums grew in abundance. With these and some sugar he made a meal, though not a good one, for the berries were quite green and intensely sour. All that day Dick Varley followed up the trail of his companions, which he discovered at a ford in the river. They had crossed, therefore, in safety, though still pursued, so he ran on at a regular trot, and with a little more hope than he had felt during the day. Towards night, however, Dick's heart sank again, for he came upon innumerable buffalo tracks, among which those of the horses soon became mingled up, so that he lost them altogether. Hoping to find them again more easily by broad daylight, he went to the nearest clump of willows he could find, and encamped for the night. Remembering the use formerly made of the tall willows, he set to work to construct a covering to protect him from the dew. As he had no blanket or buffalo skin, he used leaves and grass instead. and found it a better shelter than he had expected, especially when the fire was lighted and a pannikin of hot sugar and water smoked at his feet. But as no game was to be found, he was again compelled to sup off unripe berries. Before lying down to rest, he remembered his resolution, and, pulling out the little Bible, read a portion of it by the fitful blaze of the fire, and felt great comfort in its blessed words. It seemed to him like a friend with whom he could converse in the midst of his loneliness. The plunge into the river having broken Dick's pipe and destroyed his tobacco, he now felt the want of that luxury very severely, and, never having wanted it before, he was greatly surprised to find how much he had become enslaved to the habit. It cost him more than an hour's rest that night, the craving for his wonted pipe. The sagacious reader will doubtless not fail here to ask himself the question, whether it is wise in man to create in himself an unnatural and totally unnecessary appetite, which may, and often does, entail hours, aye, sometimes months, of exceeding discomfort. But we would not for a moment presume to suggest such a question to him. We have a distinct objection to the ordinary method of what is called drawing a moral. It is much better to leave wise men to do this for themselves. Next morning Dick rose with the sun and started without breakfast, preferring to take his chance of finding a bird or animal of some kind before long, to feeding again on sour berries. He was disappointed, however, in finding the tracks of his companions. The ground here was hard and sandy, so that little or no impression of a distinct kind was made on it, and as buffaloes had traversed it in all directions, he was soon utterly bewildered. He thought it possible that, by running out for several miles in a straight line, and then taking a wide circuit round, he might find the tracks emerging from the confusion made by the buffaloes. But he was again disappointed, for the buffalo tracks still continued, and the ground became less capable of showing a footprint. Soon Dick began to feel so ill and weak from eating such poor fare that he gave up all hope of discovering the tracks, and was compelled to push forward at his utmost speed in order to reach a less barren district, where he might procure fresh meat. But the further he advanced, the worse and more sandy did the district become. For several days he pushed on over this arid waste without seeing bird or beast, and, to add to his misery, he failed at last to find water. For a day and a night he wandered about in a burning fever, and his throat so parched that he was almost suffocated. Towards the close of the second day he saw a slight line of bushes away down in a hollow on his right. With eager steps he staggered towards them, and, on drawing near, beheld a blessed sight, a stream of water glancing in the beams of the setting sun. Dick tried to shout for joy, but his parched throat refused to give utterance to the voice. It mattered not. Exerting all his remaining strength, he rushed down the bank, dropped his rifle, and plunged head foremost into the stream. The first mouthful sent a thrill of horror to his heart. It was as salt as brine. The poor youth's cup of bitterness was now full to overflowing. Crawling out of the stream, he sank down on the bank in a species of lethargic torpor, from which he awakened the next morning in a raging fever. Delirium soon rendered him insensible to his sufferings. The sun rose like a ball of fire, and shone down with scorching power on the arid plain. What mattered it to Dick? He was far away in the shady groves of the Mustang Valley, chasing the deer at times, but more frequently cooling his limbs and sporting with Crusoe in the bright blue lake. Now he was in his mother's cottage, telling her how he had thought of her when he was far away on the prairie, and what a bright, sweet world it was she had whispered in his ear, so unexpectedly too. Anon he was scouring over the plains on horseback, with the savages at his heels, and at such times Dick would spring with almost supernatural strength from the ground, and run madly over the burning plain. But, as if by a species of fascination, he always returned to the salt river, and sank exhausted by its side, or plunged helplessly into its waters. These sudden immersions usually restored him for a short time to reason, and he would crawl up the bank and gnaw a morsel of the maple sugar. But he could not eat much, for it was in a tough, compact cake, which his jaws had not power to break. All that day and the next night he lay on the banks of the salt stream, or rushed wildly over the plain. It was about noon of the second day after his attack that he crept slowly out of the water, into which he had plunged a few seconds before. His mind was restored, but he felt an indescribable sensation of weakness that seemed to him to be the approach of death. Creeping towards the place where his rifle lay, he fell exhausted beside it, and laid his cheek on the Bible, which had fallen out of his pocket there. While his eyes were closed in a dreamy sort of half-waking slumber, he felt the rough, hairy coat of an animal brush against his forehead. The idea of being torn to pieces by wolves flashed instantly across his mind, and with a shriek of terror he sprang up, to be almost overwhelmed by the caresses of his faithful dog. Yes, there he was, bounding round his master, barking and whining, and giving vent to every possible expression of canine joy. End of chapter 13. Of the dog Crusoe and his master. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 14. Crusoe's Return and His Private Adventures Among the Indians. Dick at a very low ebb. Crusoe saves him. The means by which Crusoe managed to escape from his two-legged captors and rejoin his master requires separate and special notice. In the struggle with the fallen horse and Indian, which Dick had seen begun but not concluded, he was almost crushed to death, and the instant the Indian gained his feet he sent an arrow at his head with savage violence. Crusoe, however, had been so well used to dodging the blunt-headed arrows that were wont to be shot at him by the boys of the Mustang Valley that he was quite prepared, and eluded the shaft by an active bound. Moreover, he uttered one of his own peculiar roars, flew at the Indian's throat, and dragged him down. At the same moment the other Indians came up, and one of them turned aside to rescue. This man happened to have an old gun, of the cheap sort at the time, exchanged for peltries by the fur traders. With the butt of this he struck Crusoe a blow on the head that sent him sprawling on the grass. The rest of the savages, as we have seen, continued in pursuit of Dick until he leaped into the river. Then they returned, took the saddle and bridle off his dead horse, and rejoined their comrades. Here they held a court-martial on Crusoe, who was now bound, foot and muzzle, with cords. Some were for killing him. Others, who admired his noble appearance, immense size, and courage, thought it would be well to carry him to their village and keep him. There was a pretty violent dispute on the subject, but at length it was agreed that they should spare his life in the meantime, and perhaps have a dog dance round him when they got to their wigwams. This dance, of which Crusoe was to be the chief, though passive performer, is peculiar to some of the tribes east of the Rocky Mountains, and consists in killing a dog and cutting out its liver, which is afterwards sliced into shreds or strings and hung on a pole about the height of a man's head. A band of warriors then come and dance wildly round this pole, and each one in succession goes up to the raw liver and bites a piece off it, without, however, putting his hands near it. Such is the dog dance, and to such was poor Crusoe destined by his fierce captors, especially by the one whose throat still bore the very evident marks of his teeth. But Crusoe was much too clever a dog to be disposed of in so disgusting a manner. He had privately resolved in his own mind that he would escape, but the hopelessness of his ever carrying that resolution into effect would have been apparent to any one who could have seen the way in which his muzzle was secured and his four paws were tied together in a bunch, as he hung suspended across the saddle of one of the savages. This particular party of Indians who had followed Dick Varley determined not to wait for the return of their comrades, who were in pursuit of the other two hunters, but to go straight home. So for several days they galloped away over the prairie. At nights, when they encamped, Crusoe was thrown on the ground like a piece of old lumber, and left to lie there with a mere scrap of food till morning, when he was again thrown across the horse of his captor and carried on. When the village was reached, he was thrown again on the ground, and would certainly have been torn to pieces in 5 minutes by the Indian curs which came howling round him, had not an old woman come to the rescue and driven them away. With the help of her grandson, a naked little creature, just able to walk, or rather to stagger, she dragged him to her tent, and undoing the line that fastened his mouth, offered him a bone. Although lying in a position that was unfavorable for eating purposes, Crusoe opened his jaws and took it. An awful crash was followed by 2 crunches, and it was gone. And Crusoe looked up in the old squaw's face with a look that said plainly, "Another of the same, please, and quick as possible." The old woman gave him another, and then a lump of meat, which latter went down in a gulp, but he coughed after it, and it was well he didn't choke. After this the squaw left him, and Crusoe spent the remainder of that night gnawing the cords that bound him. So diligent was he that he was free before morning and walked deliberately out of the tent. Then he shook himself, and with a yell that one might have fancied was intended for defiance, he bounded joyfully away and was soon out of sight. To a dog with a good appetite, which had been on short allowance for several days, the mouthful given to him by the old squaw was a mere nothing. All that day he kept bounding over the plain from bluff to bluff in search of something to eat, but found nothing until dusk, when he pounced suddenly and most unexpectedly on a prairie hen fast asleep. In one moment its life was gone. In less than a minute its body was gone too, feathers and bones and all, down Crusoe's ravenous throat. On the identical spot Crusoe lay down and slept like a top for 4 hours. At the end of that time he jumped up, bolted a scrap of skin that had somehow been overlooked at supper, and flew straight over the prairie to the spot where he had had the scuffle with the Indian. He came to the edge of the river, took precisely the same leap that his master had done before him, and came out on the other side a good deal higher up than Dick had done, for the dog had no savages to dodge, and was, as we have said before, a powerful swimmer. It cost him a good deal of running about to find the trail, and it was nearly dark before he resumed his journey. Then, putting his keen nose to the ground, he ran step by step over Dick's track, and at last found him, as we have shown, on the banks of the Salt Creek. It is quite impossible to describe the intense joy which filled Dick's heart on again beholding his favorite. Only those who have lost and found as such can know it. Dick seized him round the neck and hugged him as well as he could, poor fellow, in his feeble arms. Then he wept, then he laughed, and then he fainted. This was a consummation that took Crusoe quite aback. Never having seen his master in such a state before, he seemed to think at first that he was playing some trick, for he bounded round him and barked and wagged his tail. But as Dick lay quite still and motionless, he went forward with a look of alarm, snuffed him once or twice, and whined piteously. Then he raised his nose in the air and uttered a long, melancholy wail. The cry seemed to revive Dick, for he moved, and with some difficulty sat up, to the dog's evident relief. There is no doubt whatever that Crusoe learned an erroneous lesson that day, and was firmly convinced thenceforth that the best cure for a fainting fit is a melancholy yell. So easy it was for the wisest of dogs as well as the men to fall into gross error. "Crusoe," said Dick, in a feeble voice, "dear good pup, come here." He crawled as he spoke down to the water's edge, where there was a level patch of dry sand. "Dig," said Dick, pointing to the sand. Crusoe looked at him in surprise, as well he might, for he had never heard the word dig in all his life before. Dick pondered a minute, and then a thought struck him. He turned up a little of the sand with his fingers, and pointing to the hole, he cried, "Seek 'em out, pup." Ha! Crusoe understood that. Many and many a time he had unhoused rabbits and squirrels and other creatures at that word of command. So without a moment's delay he commenced to dig down into the sand, every now and then stopping for a moment and shoving in his nose and snuffing interrogatively, as if he fully expected to find a buffalo at the bottom of it. Then he would resume again, one paw after another, so fast you could scarce see them going, hand over hand, as sailors would have called it, while the sand flew out between his hind legs in a continuous shower. When the sand accumulated so much behind him as to impede his motions, he scraped it out of his way, and set to work again with tenfold earnestness. After a good while he paused and looked up at Dick with an "It won't do, I fear there's nothing here" expression on his face. "Seek 'em out, pup," repeated Dick. "Oh, very good," mutely answered the dog, and went at it again, tooth and nail, harder than ever. In the course of a quarter of an hour there was a deep yawning hole in the sand, into which Dick peered with intense anxiety. The bottom appeared slightly damp. Hope now reanimated Dick Varley, and by various devices he succeeded in getting the dog to scrape away a sort of tunnel from the hole, into which he might roll himself and put down his lips to drink when the water should rise high enough. Impatiently and anxiously he lay watching the moisture slowly accumulate in the bottom of the hole, drop by drop, and while he gazed he fell into a troubled, restless slumber, and dreamed that Crusoe's return was a dream, and that he was alone again, perishing for want of water. When he awakened, the hole was full of clear water, and Crusoe was lapping it greedily. "Back, pup!" he shouted, as he crept down to the hole and put his trembling lips to the water. It was brackish, but drinkable, and as Dick drank deeply of it, he esteemed it at that moment better than nectar. Here he lay for half an hour, alternately drinking and gazing in surprise at his own emaciated visage as reflected in the pool. That same afternoon Crusoe, in a private hunting excursion of his own, discovered and caught a prairie hen, which he quietly proceeded to devour on the spot, when Dick, who saw what had occurred, whistled to him. Obedience was ingrained in every fibre of Crusoe's mental being. He did not merely answer at once to the call, he sprang to it, leaving the prairie hen untasted. "Fetch it, pup!" cried Dick eagerly as the dog came up. In a few moments the hen was at his feet. Dick's circumstances could not brook the delay of the cookery. He gashed the bird with his knife and drank the blood, and then gave the flesh to the dog, while he crept to the pool again for another draught. Ah! think not, reader, that although we have treated this subject in a slight vein of pleasantry, because it ended well, that therefore our tale is pure fiction. Not only are Indians glad to satisfy the urgent cravings of hunger with raw flesh, but many civilized men and delicately nurtured have done the same, ay, and doubtless will do the same again, as long as enterprising and fearless men shall go forth to dare the dangers of flood and field in the wild places of our wonderful world. Crusoe had finished his share of the feast before Dick returned from the pool. Then master and dog lay down together side by side, and fell into a long, deep, peaceful slumber. Chapter 15 of The Dog Crusoe and His Master. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 15. Health and Happiness Return. Incidents of the Journey. A Buffalo Shot. A Wild Horse Creased. Dick's Battle with a Mustang. Dick Varley's fears and troubles, in the meantime, were ended. On the day following he awoke refreshed and happy, so happy and light at heart as he felt the glow of returning health coursing through his veins that he fancied he must have dreamed it all. In fact, he was so certain that his muscles were strong that he endeavored to leap up, but was powerfully convinced of his true condition by the miserable stagger that resulted from the effort. However, he knew he was recovering. So he rose, and thanking God for his recovery, and for the new hope that was raised in his heart, he went down to the pool and drank deeply of its water. Then he returned, and, sitting down beside his dog, opened the Bible and read long, and for the first time earnestly, the story of Christ's love for sinful man. He at last fell asleep over the book, and when he awakened he felt so much refreshed in body and mind that he determined to attempt to pursue his journey. He had not proceeded far when he came upon a colony of prairie dogs. Upon this occasion he was little inclined to take a humorous view of the vagaries of these little curious creatures, But he shot one, and, as before, ate part of it raw. These creatures are so active that they are difficult to shoot, and even when killed, generally fall into their holes and disappear. Crusoe, however, soon unearthed the dead animal on this occasion. That night the travelers came to a stream of fresh water, and Dick killed a turkey, so that he determined to spend a couple of days there to recruit. At the end of that time he set out again, but was only able to advance 5 miles when he broke down. In fact, it became evident to him that he must have a longer period of absolute repose ere he could hope to continue his journey, but to do so without food was impossible. Fortunately there was plenty of water, as his course lay along the margin of a small stream, and, as the arid piece of prairie was now behind him, he hoped to fall in with birds, or perhaps deer, soon. While he was plodding heavily and wearily along, pondering these things, he came to the brow of a wave from which he beheld a most magnificent view of green grassy plains, decked with flowers, and rolling out into the horizon, with a stream meandering through it, and clumps of trees scattered everywhere far and wide. It was a glorious sight, but the most glorious object in it to Dick, at that time, was a fat buffalo which stood grazing not 100 yards off. The wind was blowing towards him, so that the animal did not scent him, and, as he came up very slowly, and it was turned away, it did not see him. Crusoe would have sprang forward in an instant, but his master's finger imposed silence and caution. Trembling with eagerness, Dick sank flat down in the grass, cocked both barrels of his piece, and, resting it on his left hand with his left elbow on the ground, he waited until the animal should present its side. In a few seconds it moved. Dick's eye glanced along the barrel, but it trembled. His wonted steadiness of aim was gone. He fired, and the buffalo sprang off in terror. With a groan of despair he fired again, almost recklessly, and the buffalo fell. It rose once or twice, and stumbled forward a few paces, and then it fell again. Meanwhile Dick reloaded with trembling hand, and advanced to give it another shot, but it was not needful. The buffalo was already dead. "Now, Crusoe," said Dick, sitting down on the buffalo's shoulder and patting his favorite on the head, "we're all right at last. You and I shall have a jolly time, old pup, from this time forward." Dick paused for breath, and Crusoe wagged his tail and looked as if to say, "As if." We tell you what it is, reader. It's of no use at all to go on writing "as if" when we tell you what Crusoe said. If there is any language in eyes whatsoever, if there is language in a tail, in a cocked ear, in a mobile eyebrow, in the point of a canine nose, there is language in any terrestrial thing at all, apart from that which flows from the tongue, then Crusoe spoke. Do we not speak at this moment to you? And if so, then tell me, wherein lies the difference between a written letter and a given sign? Yes, Crusoe spoke. He said to Dick as plain as a dog could say it, slowly and emphatically, "That's my opinion precisely, Dick. You're the dearest, most beloved, jolliest fellow that ever walked on 2 legs, you are, and whatever's your opinion is mine, no matter how absurd it may be." Dick evidently understood him perfectly, for he laughed as he looked at him and patted him on the head and called him a "funny dog." Then he continued his discourse. "Yes, pup, we'll make our camp here for a long bit, old dog, in this beautiful plain. We'll make a willow wigwam to sleep in, just you and me, just in yon clump of trees, not a stone's throw to our right, where we'll have a run of pure water beside us, and be near our buffalo at the same time, for you see we'll need to watch him lest the wolves take a notion to eat him. That'll be your duty, pup. Then I'll skin him when I get strong enough, which'll be in a day or 2, I hope, and we'll put one half of the skin below us, and the other half us into camp, and sleep and eat and take it easy for a week or 2, won't we, pup?" "Hooray!" shouted Crusoe, with a jovial wag of his tail that no human arm with hat or cap or kerchief ever equalled. Poor Dick Varley! He smiled to think how earnestly he had been talking to the dog, but he did not cease to do it, for, although he entered into discourses, the drift of which Crusoe's limited education did not permit him to follow, he found comfort in hearing the sound of his own voice, and in knowing that it fell pleasantly on another ear in that lonely wilderness. Our hero now set about his preparations as vigorously as he could. He cut the buffalo's tongue out, a matter of great difficulty to one in his weak state, and carried it to a pleasant spot near to the stream, where the turf was level and green, and decked with wild flowers. Here he resolved to make his camp. His first care was to select a bush whose branches were long enough to form a canopy over his head when bent, and the ends thrust into the ground. The completing of this exhausted him greatly, but after a rest he resumed his labors. The next thing was to light a fire, a comfort which he had not enjoyed for many weary days. Not that he required it for warmth, for the weather was extremely warm, but he required it to cook with, and the mere sight of a blaze in a dark place is a most heart-cheering thing, as everyone knows. When the fire was lighted, he filled his pannikin at the brook and put it on to boil, and, cutting several slices of buffalo tongue, he thrust short stakes through them and set them up before the fire to roast. By this time the water was boiling, so he took it off with difficulty, nearly burning his fingers and singeing the tail of his coat in so doing. Into the pannikin he put a lump of maple sugar and stirred it about with a stick, and tasted it. It seemed to him even better than tea or coffee. It was absolutely delicious. Really, one has no notion what he can do if he makes believe very hard. The human mind is a nicely balanced and extremely complex machine, and when thrown a little off balance can be made to believe almost anything, as we see in the case of some poor monomaniacs who have fancied that they were made of all sorts of things, glass and porcelain and such like. No wonder then that poor Dick Varley, after so much suffering and hardship, came to regard that pannikin of hot syrup as the most delicious beverage he ever drank. During all these operations Crusoe sat on his haunches beside him and looked. And you haven't got the most distant notion of the way in which that dog maneuvered with his head and face. He opened his eyes wide and cocked his ears and turned his head first a little to one side and then a little to the other. After that he turned it a good deal to one side and then a good deal more to the other. Then he brought it straight and raised one eyebrow a little, and then the other a little, and then both together very much. Then, when Dick paused to rest and did nothing, Crusoe looked mild for a moment and yawned vociferously. Presently Dick moved, up went the ears again, and Crusoe came, in military parlance, to the position of attention. At last supper was ready, and they began. Dick had purposely kept the dog's supper back from him, in order that they might eat it in company, and between every bite and sup that Dick took, he gave a bite, but not a sup, to Crusoe. Thus lovingly they ate together, and, when Dick lay that night under the willow branches looking up through them at the stars, with his feet to the fire, and Crusoe close along his side, he thought it was the best and sweetest supper he ever ate, and the happiest evening he ever spent, so wonderfully do circumstances modify our notions of felicity. 2 weeks after this, Richard was himself again. The muscles were springy, and the blood coursed fast and free, as was its wont. Only a slight, and perhaps salutary feeling of weakness remained, to remind him that young muscles might again become more helpless than those of an aged man or child. Dick had left his encampment a week ago, and was now advancing by rapid stages toward the Rocky Mountains, closely following the trail of his lost comrades, which he had no difficulty in finding and keeping, now that Crusoe was with him. The skin of the buffalo that he had killed was now strapped to his shoulders, and the skin of another animal that he had shot a few days after was cut up into a long line and slung in a coil around his neck. Crusoe was also laden. He had a little bundle of meat slung on each side of him. For some time past, numerous herds of mustangs or wild horses had crossed their path, and Dick was now on the lookout for a chance to crease one of these magnificent creatures. On one occasion a band of mustangs galloped close up to him before they were aware of his presence, and stopped short with a wild snort of surprise on beholding him. Then, wheeling around, they dashed away at full gallop, their long tails and manes flying wildly in the air, and their hoofs thundering on the plain. Dick did not attempt to crease one upon this occasion, fearing that his recent illness might have rendered his hand too unsteady for so extremely delicate an operation. In order to crease a wild horse, the hunter requires to be a perfect shot, and it is not every man of the West who carries a rifle that can do it successfully. Creasing consists of sending a bullet through the gristle of the mustang's neck, just above the bone, so as to stun the animal. If the ball enters a hair's breadth too low, the horse falls dead instantly. If it hits the exact spot, the horse falls as instantaneously and dead to all appearance. But in reality, he is only stunned, and if left for a few minutes, will rise and gallop away nearly as well as ever. When hunters crease a horse successfully, they put a rope or halter round his under jaw and hobbles around his feet, so that when he rises he is secured, and after considerable trouble reduced to obedience. The mustangs which roam in wild freedom on the prairies of the far West are descended from the noble Spanish steeds that were brought over by the wealthy cavaliers who accompanied Fernando Cortez, the conqueror of Mexico, in his expedition to the world in 1518. These bold and, we may add, lawless cavaliers were mounted on the finest horses that could be procured from the Barbary and the deserts of the Old World. The poor Indians of the New World were struck with amazement and terror at these awful beings, for, never having seen horses before, they believed that horse and rider were one animal. During the wars that followed, many of the Spaniards were killed and their steeds bounded into the wilds of the new country to enjoy a life of unrestrained freedom. These were the forefathers of the present race of magnificent creatures which are found in immense droves all over the western wilderness, from the Gulf of Mexico to the confines of the snowy regions of the far north. At first the Indians beheld these horses with awe and terror, but gradually they became accustomed to them, and finally succeeded in capturing great numbers and reducing them to a state of servitude. Not, however, to the service of the cultivated field, but to the service of the chase and war. The savages soon acquired the method of capturing wild horses by means of the lasso, as the noose at that end of a long line of rawhide is termed, which they adroitly threw over the heads of the animals and secured them, having previously run them down. At the present day many of the savage tribes of the West almost live upon horseback, and without these useful creatures they could scarcely subsist, as they are almost indispensable in the chase of the buffalo. Mustangs are regularly taken by the Indians to the settlement of the white men for trade, but very poor specimens are these of the breed of wild horses. This arises from two causes. First, the Indian cannot overtake the finest of a drove of wild mustangs, because his own steed is inferior to the best among the wild ones, besides being weighted with a rider, so that only the weak and inferior animals are captured. And secondly, when the Indian does succeed in lassoing a first-rate horse, he keeps it for his own use. Thus, those who have not visited the far-off prairies and seen the mustang in all the glory of untrammeled freedom can form no adequate idea of its beauty, fleetness, and strength. The horse, however, was not the only creature imported by Cortez. There were priests in his army who rode upon asses, and, although we cannot imagine that the fathers charged with the cavaliers and were unhorsed, or rather unassed, in a battle, yet somehow the asses got rid of their riders and joined the Spanish chargers in their joyous bound into a new life of freedom. Hence wild asses are also found in the western prairies. But think not, reader, of those poor miserable wretches we see at home, which seem little better than rough doormats sewed up and stuffed, with head, tail, and legs attached, and just enough of life infused to make them move. No, the wild ass of the prairie is a large, powerful, swift creature. He has the same long ears, it is true, and the same hideous, exasperating bray, and the same tendency to flourish his heels. But, for all that, he is a very fine animal, and often wages successful warfare with the wild horse. But to return. The next drove of mustangs that Dick and Crusoe saw were feeding quietly and unsuspectingly in a rich green hollow in the plain. Dick's heart leaped up as his eyes suddenly fell on them, for he had almost discovered himself before he was aware of their presence. "Down, pup!" he whispered as he sank and disappeared among the grass which was just long enough to cover him when lying quite flat. Crusoe crouched immediately, and his master made his observations of the drove, and the dispositions of the ground that might favor his approach, for they were not within rifle range. Having done so, he crept slowly back until the undulation of the prairie hid him from view. Then he sprang to his feet and ran a considerable distance along the bottom until he gained the extreme end of a belt of low bushes, which would effectually conceal him while he approached to within 100 yards or less of the troop. Here he made his arrangements. Throwing down his buffalo robe, he took the coil of line and cut off a piece about 3 yards in length. On this he made a running noose. The longer line he also prepared with a running noose. These he threw in a coil over his arm. He also made a pair of hobbles and placed them in the breast of his coat, and then, taking up his rifle, advanced cautiously through the bushes, Crusoe following close behind him. In a few minutes he was gazing in admiration at the mustangs, which were now within easy shot, and utterly ignorant of the presence of man, for Dick had taken care to approach in such a way that the wind did not carry the scent of him in their direction. And well might he admire them. The wild horse of these regions is not very large, but it is exceedingly powerful, with prominent eye, sharp nose, distended nostril, small feet, and a delicate leg. Their beautiful manes hung at great lengths down their arched necks, and their thick tails swept the ground. One magnificent fellow in particular attracted Dick's attention. It was of a rich dark brown color, with black mane and tail, and seemed to be the leader of the drove. Although not the nearest to him, he resolved to crease this horse. It is said that creasing generally destroys or damages the spirit of the horse, so Dick determined to try whether his powers of close shooting would not serve him on the occasion. Going down on one knee, he aimed at the creature's neck, just a hair breadth above the spot where he had been told that hunters usually hit them, and fired. The effect upon the group was absolutely tremendous. With wild cries and snorting terror they tossed their proud heads in the air, uncertain for one moment in which direction to fly. Then there was a rush as if a hurricane swept over the place, and they were gone. But the brown horse was down. Dick did not wait until the others had fled. He dropped his rifle, and with the speed of a deer sprang towards the fallen horse, and affixed the hobbles to its leg. His aim had been true. Although scarcely half a minute elapsed between the shot and the fixing of the hobbles, the animal recovered, and with a frantic exertion rose on his haunches, just as Dick had fastened the noose of the short line in his under jaw. But this was not enough. If the horse had gained his feet before the longer line was placed round his neck, he would have escaped. As the mustang made the second violent plunge that placed it on its legs, Dick flung the noose hastily. It caught on one ear, and would have fallen off, had the horse not suddenly shaken its head, and unwittingly sealed its own fate by bringing the noose around its neck. And now the struggle began. Dick knew well enough, from hearsay, the method of breaking down a wild horse. He knew that the Indians choke them with the noose round the neck until they fall down exhausted and covered with foam. When they creep up, fix the hobbles and the line in the lower jaw, and then loosen the lasso to let the horse breathe, and resume its plunging till it is almost subdued, when they gradually draw near and breathe into its nostrils. But the violence and strength of this animal rendered this an apparently hopeless task. We have already seen that the hobbles and noose in the lower jaw had been fixed, so that Dick had nothing now to do but to choke his captive, and tire him out, while Crusoe remained a quiet though excited spectator of the scene. But there seemed to be no possibility of choking this horse. Either the muscles of his neck were too strong, or there was something wrong with the noose which prevented it from acting, for the furious creature dashed and bounded backwards and sideways in its terror for nearly an hour, dragging Dick after it, till he was almost exhausted, and yet at the end of that time, although flecked with foam and panting with terror, it seemed as strong as ever. Dick held both lines, for the short one attached to its lower jaw gave him great power over it. At last he thought of seeking assistance from his dog. "Crusoe!" he cried. "Lay hold, pup!" The dog seized the long line in his teeth and pulled with all his might. At the same moment Dick let go the short line and threw all his weight upon the long one. The noose tightened suddenly under this strain, and the mustang with a gasp fell choking to the ground. Dick had often heard of the manner in which the Mexicans break their horses, so he determined to abandon the method which had already almost worn him out, and adopt the other, as far as the means in his power rendered it possible. Instead, therefore, of loosening the lasso and recommencing the struggle, he tore a branch from the neighboring bush, cut the hobbles, strode with his legs across the fallen steed, seized the end of the short line or bridle, and then, ordering Crusoe to quit his hold, he loosened the noose which compressed the horse's neck, and had already well nigh terminated its existence. One or two deep sobs restored it, and in a moment it leaped to its feet with Dick firmly on its back. To say that the animal leaped and kicked in its frantic efforts to throw this intolerable burden would be a tame manner of expressing what took place. Words cannot adequately describe the scene. It reared, plunged, shrieked, vaulted into the air, stood straight up on its hind legs, and then almost as straight upon its fore ones, but its rider held on like a burr. Then the mustang raced wildly forwards a few paces, then as wildly back, and then stood still and trembled violently. But this was only a brief lull in the storm, so Dick saw that the time was now come to assert the superiority of his race. "Stay back, Crusoe, and watch my rifle, pup," he cried, and raising his heavy switch he brought it down with a sharp cut across the horse's flank, at the same time loosening the rein, which hitherto he had held tight. The wild horse uttered a passionate cry and sprang forward like the bolt from a crossbow. And now commenced a race, which, if not as prolonged, was at least as furious as that of the far famed Mazeppa. Dick was a splendid rider, however, at least as far as "sticking on" goes. He might not have come up to the precise pitch desiderated by a riding master in regard to carriage, etc., but he rode that wild horse of the prairie with as much ease as he had formerly ridden his own good steed, whose bones had been picked by the wolves not long ago. The pace was tremendous, for the youth's weight was nothing to that muscular frame which bounded with cat-like agility from wave to wave of the undulating plain in ungovernable terror. In a few minutes the clump of willows where Crusoe and his rifle lay were out of sight behind. But it mattered not, for Dick had looked up at the sky and noted the position of the sun at the moment of the starting. Away they went on the wings of the wind, mile after mile over the ocean-like waste, curving slightly aside now and then to avoid the bluffs that occasionally appeared on the scene for a few minutes, and then swept out of sight behind them. Then they came to a little rivulet. It was a mere brook of a few feet wide and 2 or 3 yards, perhaps, from bank to bank. Over this they flew, so easily that the spring was scarcely felt, and continued the headlong course. And now a more barren country was around them. Sandy ridges and scrubby grass appeared everywhere, reminding Dick of the place where he had been so ill. Rocks, too, were scattered about, and at one place the horse dashed with clattering hoofs between a couple of rocky sandhills, which, for a few seconds, hid the prairie from view. Here the mustang suddenly shied with such violence that his rider was nearly thrown, while a rattlesnake darted from the path. Soon they emerged from this pass, and again the plains became green and verdant. Presently a distant line of trees showed that they were approaching water, and in a few minutes they were close on it. For the first time Dick felt alarm. He sought to check his steed, but no force he could exert had the smallest influence on it. Trees and bushes flew past in bewildering confusion. The river was before him, what width he could not tell, but he was reckless now, like his charger, which he struck with the willow rod with all his force as they came up. One tremendous bound, and they were across, but Dick had to lie flat on the mustang's back as it crashed through the bushes to avoid being scraped by the trees. Again they were on the open plain, and the wild horse began to show signs of exhaustion. Now was its rider's opportunity to assert his dominion. He plied the willow rod and urged the panting horse on until it was white with foam, and labored a little in its gait. Then Dick gently drew the halter, and it broke into a trot, still tighter, and it walked, and in another minute stood still, trembling in every limb. Dick now quietly rubbed its neck and spoke to it in soothing tones, then he wheeled it gently round and urged it forward. It was quite subdued and docile. In a little time they came to the river and forded it, after which they went through the belt of woodland at a walk. By the time they reached the open prairie, the mustang was recovered sufficiently to feel its spirit returning, so Dick gave it a gentle touch with the switch, and away they went on their return journey. But it amazed Dick not a little to find how long that journey was. Very different was the pace, too, from the previous mad gallop, and often would the poor horse have stopped had Dick allowed him. But this might not be. The shades of night were approaching, and the camp lay a long way ahead. At last it was reached, and Crusoe came out with great demonstrations of joy, but was sent back lest he should alarm the horse. Then Dick jumped off his back, stroked his head, put his cheek close to his mouth, and whispered softly to him, after which he fastened him to a tree and rubbed him down slightly with a bunch of grass. Having done this, he left him to graze as far as his tether would permit, and, after supping with Crusoe, lay down to rest, not a little elated with his success in this first attempt at creasing and breaking a mustang. Chapter 15.